Okay, so we're going to start. First of all, welcome everyone. In Lebanon, the economic crisis and the port explosion alongside the pandemic have left the Lebanese healthcare system more vulnerable than ever. As the inflation of the Lebanese lira and the deteriorating situation puts medical staff under exploitation and continues to push them towards immigration or unemployment, while the healthcare sector continues to crumble, where do we stand? And who is to blame? Since the start of the pandemic, the state's ineffective and oppressive policies, as well as its incompetence and mismanagement of the pandemic in accordance with the needs of the people, has posed more threats on people's health on top of the virus outbreak. Amidst this collapse, the measures taken by the state during the pandemic have led to an extreme deterioration on the lives of marginalized groups across Lebanon, including women, migrant workers, working class families, members of the LGBTQ community, and refugees and immigrants. The AUB Secular Club welcomes you to our panel discussion, COVID under an oppressive political system and people left to their fate, with Dr. Sausan Abdurrahim and researcher Nizar Khan. Before we start, let me introduce the speakers. Nizar Khanim is the Director of Research and co-founder of Triangle Consulting, a development, policy, and media consulting firm which specializes in analyzing policies and programs in order to provide evidence-based recommendations to policymakers and international agencies, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. Mr. Ghanem will be discussing the privatization of healthcare sector, pharmaceutical companies, and the central bank's policies that have contributed to the crisis. Dr. Sausan Abdurrahim is an associate professor and chair in the Faculty of Health Sciences at AUB. Abdurrahim's research focuses on social inequalities in health and the structural conditions that influence the well-being of labor, migrants, and refugees. Dr. Sausan Abdurrahim will be discussing the impact of COVID-19 in Lebanon on marginalized communities, particularly migrant workers. So how about we start with Mr. Ghanem?
Hi everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this session, and hello extended to your guests as well. I'm not going to be very. I'll try to be as short as possible and concise. I think the main issue that we discuss right now in Lebanon is the fact that not only do we have a pandemic, as you said, we have also a financial crisis, a triple crisis, a monetary crisis, a sovereign debt crisis. And basically a banking crisis. So like, if you want a quadruple crisis in Lebanon right now. According to the latest update in October by the World Bank, real GDP is projected to decline by the end of 2020 was 19.2%. Then they projected as well that the real GDP would decline, contract by 13.2% in 2021, which is a very significant number, especially given that Lebanon is also basically witnessing a political instability, practically blockaded diplomatically, cannot access the foreign markets. We're speaking about more than 50 to 60% of the Lebanese population are under poverty line. Of course, we don't have concrete numbers because our statistics are in shambles because the government prefers not to give any numbers, as you know. The dearth of information we have is always from international agencies, which can take this information from the mouth of the Lebanese politicians in exchange for sometimes debt, as we know it. So what are we talking about here? I mean, in this pandemic, concretely, because it's very easy to speak about what we want in a pandemic. You know, we all want, for example, the government to give allowances for people, you know, like they're doing in the United States. Unfortunately, in Lebanon, we don't have this privilege, and on top of that, we have basically exploitation in the middle of this pandemic. and a transfer of wealth from the poorest to the wealthiest. So, for example, like the central bank now has a $24 billion supposedly in reserves. We know that there's $5 billion in CDs. The depositors' reserves is about 16.5 billion. This means that we have about 2.5 billion to spend for the next few months before we completely go hungry. And this is, of course, for many reasons. I mean, I'm not going to go deeply into the structure of the economy, but we're a rent economy, we're a rent-seeking economy. We don't produce anything. Hence, our imports are extremely larger than our exports. So we're not a productive economy. We cannot access foreign markets. We don't have dollars. And that is the basis of this crisis. In a sense, if we know how to grow the Lebanese economy, we know how to get more dollars into the system. So the question is, with these $2.5 billion, what is the government doing? What can we do? I mean, we need to give subsidies for the food, like wheat, for example, so that the people don't starve to death, which is being done, right? And then they're subsidizing the medicine, supposedly. However, what I'm going to say is that in fact, the subsidies for the past year on the pharma industry has been directed towards protecting the pharma import cartel. So in a sense, how it's working now is basically the government used to subsidize, right, all the pharma imports into Lebanon. To give you an example, Viagra, for example, for men, is considered right now is subsidized, but pads, for example, is not subsidized. Speaking about gender discrimination. So for example, Viagra, because it's supposedly medication, is subsidized by the Lebanese government and subsidized by the Lebanese taxpayers. At the same time, what goes under the umbrella of medicine is a wide array of medications and probably unnecessary, or we could use other brands, let's say, like generic medicine. This is all subsidized right now under this plan. Who receives this subsidy? Basically, we're speaking about six main importers. There's Mersaco, they have 19% of the market, 14 exclusive agencies. Fattal Group, 9% of the market share, 15 exclusive agencies. Abella, Ikhwan, 7% of the market, 13 exclusive agencies. Adwit Al-Ittihad, 30 exclusive agencies. Omnivera, 6% of the market, 14 exclusive agencies. Sadco, 6% of the market share, 9 exclusive agencies. So basically, these like 5 or 6 importers control about 54% of the market. And this is through the exclusive agency law that was implemented in 1967. And there's another law, which is the Qanun al-Wasf al-Tibbi, which is the non-substitution law, where basically a doctor could prescribe a certain medicine, and under this law, you cannot give him a medication that is similar to it, a generic one, for example. So in a sense, through this legal system, the monopolies that control the pharma industry in Lebanon are the ones that have been making about $200 million a year on the backs of the Lebanese taxpayers and consumers. So under this idea that the government is going to subsidize the medicine because it wants to protect the common man, let's say, they're literally transferring money to their cronies and continue this act of extraction, as if the political elites of the country understanding of policymaking is exactly that, extraction. So why do we have right now, if you're a corona patient right now in Lebanon, you go to a pharmacy, you can't find medication. And that is the question, is why we don't have medication. Of course, I mean, if you do a little research, you find out that the pharma importers are afraid that the central bank is not gonna give them the subsidy, right? So they're hoarding the medicine to release it in the market whenever they get paid. The question right now, so these allegations that, for example, the Lebanese are hoarding the medicine is incorrect. What's happening is basically the elites are still fighting among themselves over who's going to get the rest of the 16 billion in the central bank. That is the level, that's how low the political and economic elites of this country is. Instead of actually doing something completely different, that in such a crisis, we would be need to like allocating priorities of medication. And this is the point that I would like to say, that we cannot talk about fighting a pandemic in Lebanon without talking about the political economy of this country and how it runs. So the fact that we rely on markets according to we're a free market country according to the constitution. But at the same time, when we go to the bank to get our money back, we can't. And this is in clear violation, for example, of Qanun al-Naqd wa-Taslif, right? So this is against a constitutional principle, which is we're a free country. We take our money out because this is force majeure according to the judicial system. At the same time, the markets are not free because they're basically monopolized and concentrated in the hands of a few families, basically, since the beginning of Grand Lebanon, in a sense, in the 1920s. Just to give you an example, there was a draft law by Bilal Abdullah, actually, submitted in 13th of October. And the law wanted to stop this blanket subsidies for the pharma cartel, right? So it wanted to basically the law had three points. We need to stop the subsidies on medicine that is produced locally. So imagine if we're right now paying money, for example, for Panadol coming from Italy when we can, for example, produce it locally. So the question is, why is the subsidy covering medications that are produced locally? We're still paying out of our pockets, basically out of our deposits. The next subsidy is basically, why is the subsidies don't go for the cheapest medication global that is approved by the Ministry of Health? As we know, there are brands and there's generics, and you have a whole array of prices in the global market. So things that we're not producing locally, why aren't we can import it, but at a certain price? You can't import something that costs a lot just because you want to make a profit. And then the ceiling on certain medicines. Of course, this draft law, by the way, did not pass in the parliament. Instead, what they did, they passed they lowered the fees on cars, the annual fees, right? And they passed the law like lowering tariffs on investment and filling of water. So in the middle of a pandemic, our parliament meets, and what it does is passes legislation to protect those in power. This shows you who controls our parliament. What controls our parliament is basically the same 1%, 0.8% of the Lebanese depositors hold 50% of the value of the deposits. This 1% is the same elite that is doing right now, doing very well in the pandemic by maximizing their profits from the subsidies made by the central bank from our deposits. The law that should pass right now, that was basically taken out, shows just the real elephant in the room. In a sense, this whole pandemic with the financial crisis shows the limits of the Lebanese post-1990 financial system, the economic model that was working. Meaning that through debt, we fuel the housing market, and through debt, we pay for the official workers, basically, government officials. And then we pay for the electricity that doesn't work, which is about $2 billion a year. This system has cracked. And with it, what cracked is the way we do business, which is basically opaque, crony capitalism that does not actually accept free market principles. We say we accept free market, it's not true. Lebanon is marred by oligopolies and monopolies. So not to, what do we need and what do we need fast if we're gonna deal with the pandemic? And as independent movements, what we need to be pushing right now is about systemic policy actions on the level of the parliament. We can't be stuck by speaking about basically we need to have a monetary and financial position in the current crisis. This means we need a reform of the pharmaceutical market. So we have to tie it to a wider competition reform in Lebanon, meaning reining in on the cartels, monopolies through an advanced competition law. Imagine the EU, this is already in the making. All all the desk review and all the research about what kind of competition law can be in Lebanon is already implemented. We know already what we need to do, but we lack the political will. Why do we lack the political will? It's because of 16 families in Lebanon who control the major industries in this country, which is the banks and the service industry. We need to break the law that sanctions monopolies such as exclusive agencies. And can you imagine that right now, most of the pharmaceutical companies, what they do is they buy the exclusive agencies for certain medications just to stop it from entering the Lebanese market so that they can basically bill the Lebanese consumers more. Then we're in a situation of crisis. We need to why can't we let the government import the needed medication for corona patients? Meaning when patients go to the pharmacy to get zinc or get vitamins that is disappearing from the Lebanese market, why can't we make it in Lebanon? Or if we can't, why can't the government itself buy the needed imports? Like الهيئة العليا للإغاثة, for example. Instead, we're relying on a broken market tool. The idea that market works. Yes, market works, but it works when it's free competition. It doesn't work when it's monopolized by 5 actors that control most of the Lebanese market. The third thing we need to push for is a further reforming of the healthcare system. Meaning, when we speak about coverage, there is a tool in the 60s. In the 60s we had a strong left. It imposed on General Shab a cooperative law and a mutual fund law, which means we created cooperatives for the working class, and we created mutual funds. The mutual funds يعني اللي هي صناديق التعاضد بيسموها بلبنان. There's currently 300,000 users of mutual funds in Lebanon. However, the mutual funds, for example, are marred by corruption allegations. The mutual funds have been taken by private companies, private insurance companies, who literally lower the market price just a tiny bit just try it. Like go try to get private insurance in Lebanon. And you'll find that the cheapest ones are basically mutual funds, which basically they escape from the VAT. But the question is, the mutual funds should be giving, really, they're a tool to redistribute wealth. In a sense, giving health insurance for the middle class and for the working class. The mutual funds are taken by political groups. So we need to open the battle of mutual funds, صناديق التعاضد, that are controlled by insurance companies, and bring this tool back to the Lebanese. Because let's face it, I mean, the cooperatives and the صناديق التعاضد, coupled with a correct competition reform, can literally break the structural problems that there are other structural problems, of course, but this is just a few examples of where we could target without major campaigns, basically fix a lot of the main problems right now facing corona patients on the streets. I think also overall what this pandemic shows is that already the IMF said by the beginning of basically October 2019 that by end of 2020 we're going to have about 50% on the poverty line. The turmoil that we're seeing right now in Tripoli just shows that when the subsidies go, and they're going to go 3 months, there's not going to be any reserves in the central bank, and Lebanon going to go in a basically Venezuela scenario, and then we're going to have hunger games in Lebanon. The major issue becomes that we need solidarity among the Lebanese. And we're speaking about solidarity cross-sectional on every level. يعني تنظيم we need to be organizing on sectoral basis and bringing solidarity campaigns similar to what happened in the UB in the secular club, is organizing students, organizing doctors, organizing engineers, or organizing workers to build this big social coalition, basically, that could fight for progressive legislation. There is no reform without progressive legislation in the parliament. And the fact that these parliamentarians right now maybe have lost the popular legitimacy, but they're still responsible for legislation. And we need to hold them accountable for that. Meaning in public discourse, we need to push more and more for the Lebanese to have literacy about how the process of how they run this machine, basically, that is impoverishing us. Thank you, and sorry for if I took a bit more time.
Thank you, Mr. Ghanem. Dr. Sultan Abdulrahim, the floor is yours.
I unmuted myself. Thank you very much for the invitation, and belated congratulations for the Secular Club for their win from last semester. Just to follow up on Mr. Ghanem's intervention, I'm very troubled today by all these messages on Twitter about the absence of baby formula now in pharmacies, and I'm sure this is really it's a very disconcerting turn of events when you start to think that medicines and baby formula will disappear because of monopolies and because of financial interests. So I'm going to focus in the next 10 to 15 minutes on talking about a really vulnerable and fragile in Lebanon. I just want to make it very clear that the economic spiral in Lebanon, the pandemic, are affecting everybody, and their impact is multiplicative. But I also want to emphasize that pandemics, like all other natural or unnatural disasters, do not affect all people equally. They have a disproportionate impact on those who are already mired in poverty and who are excluded and who have limited access to healthcare to begin with. The Lebanese as well, of course, but also migrant workers, non-citizens who have less protections as well. Shortly following the outbreak, sometime in April, even in late March, April, it became very clear, and the data has shown in some parts of the world, that this myth or this cliche that COVID was the great equalizer turned out to be a myth, actually, and the data started to show that some people were affected a lot more due to COVID, whether they had a higher risk of being infected or a higher risk of experiencing severe illness and mortality if they got infected. On a side note, because also my colleague Ghanem mentioned data, I just want to also say that one of the problems we have in Lebanon is that we don't have data or information on who COVID is affecting, who is dying from COVID more than anyone, which region or which social group. The only thing we know is that older adults and people who have medical conditions are more likely to die from COVID, but then we don't have any indication of how underlying social factors are impacting how COVID has been spreading. And if we had this data, the Ministry of Health Surveillance Unit is sitting on this data. I'm not sure if they are collecting it, frankly, or they are collecting it and sitting on it. But actually having this data could have helped us a lot in addressing, in responding to the crisis that we are in right now, where the solution is a total lockdown, irrespective of how this lockdown is going to affect a wide segment of the Lebanese society. So I'm going to focus more on migrant workers, but let me say a few things about refugees because as well, particularly Syrian refugees, because I was looking at a recently published report by the International Labour Organization on how COVID has affected both Lebanese and non-Lebanese workers. And I mean, before we talk about refugees, as most of you know, a large proportion of Lebanese workers are in informal employment, and this is one of the reasons why they've been more severely impacted by COVID, because they live on daily wages. They have jobs that where they don't have contracts, where they've been laid off permanently without any benefits and without any recourse, basically. With respect to Syrians, of course, you know, the majority of Syrian men engage in construction in Lebanon. Also, Syrians engage in the agricultural sector. A lot of women and children, refugees / migrants, seasonal migrants, engage in agriculture, and they have been severely impacted. It is really worrying, actually, that the government has not had a plan or a policy to ensure that what has been talked about in other countries, called the food supply chain. It's worrying that we have to worry about bread and milk and eggs right now, because a large number of workers are basically out of work right now. They could have been working in agriculture under government, not necessarily government, but under health protections, so that they can continue to work, so that as essential workers, I mean, agricultural workers are essential workers, and protecting them to allow them to be able to work under conditions of COVID is really important for the rest of society as well. A large number of Syrian migrant workers who engage in agriculture and construction have been laid off permanently, and most of them actually did not have any work permits and didn't have any social security benefits. 95%, in fact, of Syrian workers do not have work permits. If you want to look at the other side of the coin, what this says is that there are a lot of Lebanese employers who are hiring Syrian workers and who are benefiting from the fact that these workers do not have permits and do not have social security. Unfortunately, under economic strain, we always blame the refugees for stealing our jobs, and we forget that actually they are employed by citizens, by Lebanese employers who are benefiting 10 times, hundreds of times more than the workers themselves. Let me turn to saying a few words about women migrant workers who predominantly work in the domestic and care sector in Lebanon. And many of you have seen scenes in the media sometime starting in April, but also mostly in May and June, of migrant workers being abandoned by employers and left out in front of their embassies and on the street. And while, you know, migrant workers have been abandoned by employers before, but it became the proportion of the problem increased, and it became visible in the media, given both the intersection between, or the cumulative impact of the economic crisis and COVID as well. I just want to say that Lebanon and the Arab region in general is not unique in the fact that we hire, or there are a lot of families and a lot of individuals who hire migrant workers to provide care jobs, care work, and domestic work. This is in general is a global trend, and it's been driven by basically middle-income countries and high-income countries strive to reduce the cost of care, with women entering into the labor market more over time, and with the aging population, with certain demographic and changes in the family structure. a lot of families in middle income and high income countries needed or resorted to hiring migrant workers to provide this care. What is unique in the Arab region, however, is how the system of hiring migrant workers. And we hear a lot about the kafala system or the sponsor and really dedicated activists who call for the abolishment of kafala as the main problem or the main instigator of the exploitation of migrant workers in Lebanon and the Arab region. I want to present a slightly different view related to kafala, and I'm not saying that kafala should not be abolished. I think kafala is absolutely a terrible system of employing migrant workers. It exists in the United States. It existed in Europe in the past. However, changes in the political systems and the social systems have helped basically end this system of hiring, whereby each employee or each worker is tied to one employer, and they can only migrate if they are requested to work for that employer, and then they cannot get out of that contract. They cannot get out of it easily if they're not happy with the employment conditions. They can get out of it if the situation becomes extremely severe with exploitation, trafficking, and forced labor. However, even that sometimes is difficult to prove in the context of Lebanon and in the Gulf, in the Arab Gulf region countries as well, given the power imbalance, both the power imbalance between the employer and the worker, but also the fact that the kafala system puts basically the responsibility of managing the labor contract or the labor relationship between the employer who has power and the employee who has less power. And the government basically becomes, or government institutions become engaged in basically the bureaucratic process of signing papers and providing permits, where in fact the government doesn't end up controlling the employment, the employee, or providing any protections to the employee. I think I have a couple of minutes left. I worked on a paper with a colleague from the anti-racism movement in which we basically discuss how COVID and the economic situation has impacted in specific ways migrant women who work and live in situations versus migrant women who work and live out, or what's called freelance situations. And I'm just going to mention very briefly that of course, migrant women have less autonomy in the relationship, and therefore their risk to COVID is determined not only by their own behavior, but by the context in which they live, by the behavior of family members, the members of the family that she works for. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that we always assume that migrant workers, because they come young and relatively healthy, because that's the nature of the work, they need to be young and healthy. And frankly, what happens is that once they reach age 40 or 45, the employers don't want them anymore, or particularly if a migrant woman wants to enter into a relationship, or wants to get married, or wants to have children, get pregnant and have children, the employer would say, I don't need her anymore. But one thing we miss out is that, in fact, the nature of the work that they do actually puts them at high risk and vulnerability to chronic diseases. And underlying chronic diseases is a very important risk factor for COVID. So I would be very surprised, in fact, if the data shows that migrant workers who end up having a risk on getting infected with COVID, that they would actually have a high risk of having a severe outcome due to the infection. Finally, just of course, the economic vulnerability with the inability, with basically the majority of migrant workers now earning their salaries in Lebanese currency rather than dollars, when the whole point of them immigrating and working in Lebanon is to basically earn in dollars, and the salaries of $150 to $200, the majority of migrant workers make between $200 and $250 a month, or used to. And now when they are earning their salaries in Lebanese, it's really, for them, it's a difficult situation, because there's no point of them coming and working here, because now they are not able to send remittances back to their families, to their children. On the other hand, many of them come from countries where they actually cannot go back, because, for example, women from Ethiopia, although a large number have returned to Ethiopia, but there are also many migrant workers who say, I cannot even go back to Ethiopia because my family is displaced now because of the conflict that is happening. So the economic conditions that are happening, the COVID, but also the conflict that is happening in their countries back home has put them in a difficult situation where they have to accept just staying here and not being able to send back remittances, and basically bearing the brunt of the consequences of COVID that trickles down from, like, the consequences on the employer that trickle down to the worker herself. So I'll stop here, but I can answer any questions. Sorry if I went over time.
Thank you, Dr. Sousan. We're going to ask a couple of questions now. The first one would be, Mr. Ghanem mentioned that subsidies will be disappearing in the next 3 months, leading to inability to afford needed medicines. So what does this apply to the future of the healthcare system? And how can the pandemic be controlled in such a weakened healthcare system?
I mean, that's a very interesting question. I think that what we're witnessing really in Lebanon, I mean, it's unprecedented, because we've never witnessed such a financial crisis in the history of Lebanon on that level. So, I mean, we're not speaking only about the healthcare system, but even private universities, because basically what we're witnessing, we're starving out of dollars, and this means we will not be able to keep essential workers, like basically highly skilled workers will leave. And this is the biggest danger, that we'll have a real migration of high skilled workers. That is on like short term, even medium term, definitely. On the short term level, I mean, as I said, like to start controlling the pandemic, we need an emergency plan. But there's not even an emergency plan on a financial level, like how to deal with the crisis itself. What I'm saying is that we cannot separate dealing with the pandemic from dealing with the financial crisis. What the political parties in Lebanon are doing now are literally investing more in clientelism, meaning every man for himself. The essential idea is that the state is a baqar halub. It's basically a cow. You milk the cow and you distribute the resources to your it's clientelism. This is a rent economy, and until today, the political class has not understood that we cannot do business as usual. And I think many people think that, okay, they're evil, but I think they're also incompetent. And there's a big part that the political class that rules Lebanon is a bit incompetent. We have to accept this fact. So I think on the short-term levels, we have to, as I said, like medication has to be provided by an emergency plan that buys the needed medication from the international markets. And then will be a high priority on where should the subsidies go. I mean, bread and medication. I mean, that's the major issues. Then comes the vaccination. I mean, I'm not sure if the Lebanese are going to buy any vaccine. Probably we're now being placed at fragility index in the UN. I know this because I do projects on that level now. So basically we're based between failed state and a fragile state. This is where they placed us. So we will have some assistance, I guess, as a poor country. The question is how this vaccination is going to go. Probably, again, the political blocs in the government are going to fight over how to distribute this. So again, as I was saying, we always, in every, I've been working in development for the past 16 years, and every project we do, the bottleneck in any project always is the governance aspect. So basically, with unfortunately, after October 17 is not like before it. We cannot go to business as usual. This means we need a proper reformulation of the government and have an emergency plan that puts priorities over medication and who's going to get the vaccination, which target groups, and these target groups cannot be sectarian based, because you see the political class is going to try to keep its power base, because they know if they lose their power base, they will lose government and they will go to jail. So there's a real vital interest for them to keep the power base. And this means they're going to try to get funds from abroad to keep funneling it and using the whole crisis, the hunger of the people, they will use it against them. In a sense, if you want to eat, you have to go to the local politician, like medieval Europe, I mean, that's what we have. We have a medieval system in Lebanon. You will have to go to this is how they're going to sustain the clientelist crony system that is Lebanon, unfortunately. So I would say I'm not optimistic, and I think that is not a bad thing not to be optimistic. Antonio Gramsci speaks about the optimism of the pessimism of the mind, optimism of the will. I mean, we have to be pessimistic, and pessimism is sometimes good, because this means that there is no way out of this. The Lebanese, bishataruton, it's just not going to work anymore. Like the fundamentals of the economy do not work. So now we need to sit on the table, typical Lebanon, like when there's a car, like بدهم يطلعوا من السيارات, and they have to work out how are we going to get out of this. And as I said, there is no separation between the financial crisis and the pandemic. They're going to go together, because unfortunately we cannot get out of the pandemic by getting more debt. We've already maxed our credit card.
Thank you, Mr. Ghanem. Does anyone else have any questions that they would like to ask? I was thinking of something based on both Dr. Abdulrahim and Mr. Ghanem's, both of your interventions, and thinking of how the management of the pandemic, or like the lack of the pandemic, is affecting marginalized groups in Lebanon. So Dr. Abdulrahim, you talked about migrant workers. So how can we think of possible, like how can we think of ways to first of all support these migrant workers? What kind of strategies or policies can be implemented in order to like improve the situation of migrant domestic workers and marginalized groups in general in the midst of the economic collapse and the lockdown, which, like as we've seen from the protests in Tripoli, is negatively impacting low-income groups and other marginalized groups. So I don't know if like it's the question is based on both of your interventions, if anyone would like to answer first.
Yeah, I can say that I think it's a complex situation, and the reason why migrant workers and refugees have been impacted severely by the economic collapse and COVID is because the system is collapsing, and because also the Lebanese are severely impacted as well. I think it's really important to think about structural solutions and not solutions related to basically generic statement. Let's abolish kafala. Let's any of the other generic statements that are presented. I think there are issues in the system that are not working and that they really have to be revamped. It's a system that's working it's a clientelist system. And unless this clientelism is dealt with, and young people at least can start to think about how to work through a framework where it's about rights and it's about citizenship, rather than being, clients to a political leader or to a political party, and being, having loyalty to a political party rather than loyalty to one's own rights in society. And I think that can be a first step towards talking about ending structural racism against refugees, against migrant workers. I'm not saying, I don't agree at all with saying that we shouldn't ask for rights of migrant workers and refugees before the Lebanese get their rights. I totally disagree with this perspective, of course. I think rights are indivisible, and you have to work towards ensuring citizenship rights to everyone. But what I'm saying is that it is difficult sometimes practically to talk about improving the conditions of migrant workers and refugees when you are faced with a situation where the system is not working. System itself is not working. It's not that it's not that there is a small problem that can be fixed with a Band-Aid. It really needs to be totally revamped. And part of that revamping would be at the same time to work on a new way of, or a new system for ensuring the rights of everyone who works and who contributes in the society, whether they are citizens or not, refugees or not refugees. So I don't know if this is practical, but that's how I see things. I don't see that saying that we have to end kafala in a situation where everything is not working. So what would ending kafala contribute in a context like this? Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, I'm not moderating.
No, I mean, I could add a bit about the, I mean, I think what I've been looking at trends on inter-Lebanese tensions, like for the past basically 4 months, because as I said, development agencies are also now tracking fragility index in Lebanon, and you see that there's an increase in theft, in crime. We're witnessing an increase in gender-based violence, for example, with the lockdown, so of course, so you can start witnessing the structural turns. You see, many people think that the fact that the Lebanese are not on the streets, that nothing is happening in the background. What you see is actually there is a social turmoil brewing under the surface in Lebanon, and this definitely affects refugees and vulnerable individuals in society much more. Like, for example, children. I'm working on a project on with school children, Syrian refugees and Lebanese, I mean, the pandemic, for example, to just see what happened to the Lebanese who don't have internet, for example, who don't have tablets or phones, and refugee children. They don't have education for the past year, basically. So NGOs that are working on this, I mean, there's a structural problem when you're getting paid less than 5,000 lira a day in a situation where there's a lira devaluation, meaning 5,000 now is less than $1 a day. We're speaking about people that cannot afford even to get a cell phone to teach their children, because this is how they teach their children, on WhatsApp through voice notes. This thing is not now like just a minority of the Lebanese. I think that when we speak about now the Lebanese, we should really say the Lebanese now are 50% under poverty line, meaning 50% now are cannot afford to live. Soon we're gonna even go deeper into like the lower poverty line. The inequality in Lebanon is going to increase in the coming year. So this means that the level of impact, you know, on, I mean, look at your families, look at just you as AUB students. I mean, you cannot, like many students now will not afford to go to private education, will not, you know, all of a sudden the whole system that is since 1990 is just collapsing. I don't know what to say, but I mean, there is, of course, the political organization, but there's other things that we could do. You know, for example, if you have a used cell phone, give it to a kid. This could like be, imagine right now in the pandemic, this could give them an education. And I think, as I said, we need wide solidarity networks. And these solidarity networks have to be everybody that is suffering from this crisis. I mean, the refugees in Lebanon that came are witnessing, come on, let's face it, it's the same geopolitical fiasco in the region. And actually, like Syria now is like Lebanon, witnessing very much similar economic crisis, meltdown of the lira and inflation that is like 400%. So, I mean, this is going to increase. My cat is coming here. So, yeah, I mean, this is only going to increase, I think. And but I think by soon as well, the kafala system, which is a multi-million-dollar industry, you can actually follow it on thinktriangle.net on policy section. We just made something about kafala, but really like like who exploits the kafala workers on a it's a multi-million-dollar industry. The level of and the most of the exploitation is not kafala workers, for example, that are home servants, as people would expect. They're actually more or less like industrial workers or workers that go to Asansuklin, hundreds and like spinnies, and majority of them are males, actually, not females, if you look at the numbers. So meaning that I mean, these people are squashed as well, foreign workers, and probably they will leave Lebanon. I mean, the next phase is going to be an interesting phase for Lebanon because the government does not have a financial plan. And what does this mean? This means that we're witnessing a very harsh market correction. Like we're going to be squeezed so hard in the next 2 years, and it's not going to be fun. I mean, you know, if you have money, give it to your like look around you. I mean, meaning we need to build solidarity groups, and I'm serious. Something like what happened in the Greek financial crisis. We're even worse than the Greek financial crisis. So we need to be very careful about people. People are going to start feeling hungry again. They're going to die, and they're going to erupt in violence, which is similar to what's going on in Tripoli right now. People will not take it, and in few months, Tripoli already before the crisis, like even a few years ago, had like I think about something like 34% poverty rate in the north. This is a few years ago. Can you imagine? I mean, Tripoli, there's 60,000 refugees in it. Like we're speaking about municipal falling apart. Infrastructures will not be able to manage. I mean, already they robbed all the infrastructure. So we have no infrastructure to even build the economy. We don't have electricity to build a productive sector. If we want to invest right now in productive sector, how? It's not, I mean, you know, so. Yeah.
Thank you both for your answers. Does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, I had a question actually. So both of you spoke about how we have huge structural issues in Lebanon, as well as, you know, the magnitude of the politico-economical crisis that we currently have. Do you think that despite this politico-economical situation, as well as the structural issues around which our country is organized, that the Lebanese government could have handled the quick spread and high threat of the disease in a better way? If so, how? And if not, was our current situation inevitable?
Who's this question for? I think go ahead, doctor.
Any of you.
Okay, I always forget to unmute myself. I think, I mean, Europe, the US, everywhere around the world is experiencing what Lebanon is experiencing in terms of the really uncontrollable spread of the virus. And I really believe that it had something to do with the virus itself. However, of course, I think Lebanon, the government absolutely could have handled, any other government could have absolutely handled the, put in place measures to protect people during lockdown. This is a huge issue. And as my colleague Ghanem said, you cannot expect people in Tripoli not to go out and engage in violence if you are basically telling them to spend a month without working. This is, I mean, not a 6-year-old child could have thought about this, not a policymaker or a parliamentarian or a minister. So, I mean, just social protection, any like financial cash payments to help people, basic needs, food, basically food, is something that the Lebanese government didn't think about. And it's unbelievable that they didn't think about it. Now, I mean, I've read things on Facebook, on Twitter that, well, Tripoli who are from Tripoli, and why do they not pay money to people in Tripoli? This is how I think this is very problematic, because we always, come back to this point that we want a rich person to pay a poor person money, when it's not about that. It's about rights. It's about protecting people. It's very problematic that even, secular and activists would write things like this on Facebook, that, the wealthy in Tripoli, from Tripoli, should have paid people. It's not like that. There should not have been people who are wealthy, like the way we have in Lebanon, like Miati and, et al. At the same time, there needs to be a government policy or plan for people to help people, to allow people to stay home for a few weeks. So, I mean, I think just to answer your question, the long-winded answer is that there is something related to the virus that I think that caused this rapid spread and this spike, but also I think just reacting or addressing the lockdowns and the impact of the lockdowns, or the lack thereof, is the real problem in Lebanon. And this whole approach, I mean, I come from public health, this whole approach of, just open more beds, open more ICUs, is absolutely ridiculous. It's really, anyways, I really don't know. I don't know who makes these policies or who is there in the room when these discussions happen about how to address COVID, but clearly things are not working out. I want to end on a positive note, but maybe after Ghanem speaks, we have to say something positive and optimistic.
No, I mean, I'm not, as I said, like Antonio Gramsci, it's pessimism of the mind, optimism of the will. But it's just hard time for Lebanon, obviously. The good thing is, as I said, I mean, the system is not going to be like it used to be, which means the fact that the Lebanese right now, the university elections has been taken by independent groups, like the secular club. We're speaking about syndicates now. They might stop the elections of the syndicates because they're afraid that this wave of new politics that is going through Lebanon and actually sweep the syndicates out of them. So it's not always that, like, always societies move in waves. They clash with the system, then they go back, they formulate a position, and they move forward. So there is something like of a dialectics, in a sense, sayrura, in history, like a process of unfolding in history. And this process, like I don't want to. I mean, I'm going about policy and economy. I can go on a little bit on philosophy, but like Hegel and Marx describe the unfolding of history, it doesn't go like linear. things go in a very complicated fashion. The Lebanese in 17 October, they destroyed an illusion. And it's not, they're not in revolution because, the system is in crisis, not because the people revolted. It's the people revolted because the system is in crisis. So meaning that right now, what we can say is there are no illusions. We know all the games. And that's why the system is in crisis. There is no way of externalizing this one, like forward, either in debt or in, for example, sectarian violence. Like the games are just limited for them. And that means that is our moment in a sense. And the moment of you young people, or groups like the Secular Club. Because it's this new politics, this new wave that has to come in Lebanon. It's just coming. It's a matter of time. We're not just asking for it. Imagine, even the international donors, they said like Paris 1, Paris 2, Paris 3, SADR, 4 international conferences to bring billions of dollars to Lebanon. What did you do with it? Nothing. No reform package. Macron comes, says the same thing. So in a sense, they're bankrupt. And this is our moment. So we need to is organized. And we need to be patient about ourselves. Like things do not move the way we design it to be. Things take time. But if you look at the history of the independent movements in Lebanon, you look at it from 2000, 2005. You cannot imagine the strength of political parties in 2005. You couldn't get one independent into the university council in AUB. Look right now where we are. So progress has been made in terms of building the opposition. What is needed is to literally, consolidate. And consolidation means basically a bigger platform, opening it to popular movements. In a sense, even when we speak about vulnerable people, what we need with them is solidarity, is more solidarity. And that builds power, because this builds power to actually enforce policies that I said are hurting the Lebanese. I mean, even as we speak now, they're taking millions of dollars out of our deposits to their friends in the pharmaceutical industry. It's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. I mean, run this country just like Turkey. We're not asking much, or like, any other neighboring country, Jordan. So in a sense, this is what is what the optimism is that we can do it by the optimism of the will, as Gramsci says. And it's exactly at the time of day that dim, that the spark comes, because there's nothing to lose in any case. I mean, right now we have to fix it. And this generation, I mean, I would say my generation as well. I'm not that old yet, hopefully. So it is our time to make a difference in Lebanon, and we can do it. Lebanon was not like that all the time. It's not something static. We think of Lebanon sometimes like it's always been like that. No, it wasn't. Look at the 60s. It wasn't like that. In the 60s, we were producing things like Daman al-Ijtima'i, we were doing like health insurance. We were fighting for cooperatives. We were fighting for Sanadiq Tada'adud. We're fighting for freedom of expression. Lebanon was a thriving democracy. It had its limitations, but it was there. And we can pull it back. And I think AUB is the place to start, because it is, in a sense, the conscience of Lebanon in many ways, the elite that came out of AUB. So that is also your responsibility, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you both for your answers. I think there are a few questions from the YouTube comment section, but I think the content, the questions were pretty much answered by like your answers for the past few questions. So unless there are any more questions from anyone here, does anyone want to ask like a last question or a last few questions?
I think I just want to reiterate and end by saying that that young people, the young generation, need to make this change. They have to make this change, and they can. So I think that's the positive note that I want to end on. things cannot continue the way they are right now, and it's inevitable that it will change. And I think with your generation, you can determine how that change happens, basically based on what is important and what is of benefit to you as you move along in life. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so I don't think anyone has. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask? Okay. Well, thank you both so much for joining us and for giving your input. This was a really interesting discussion. And thank you to those who attended the discussion, both on Zoom and on YouTube. And hopefully we'll see you at future events for the AUB Secular Club.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good
Bye.
Bye-bye.